Hi everyone, welcome to the channel After All That Years.
When Elena walked through our front door that Tuesday evening, something in her laugh made my blood run cold. After 22 years of marriage, you learn to read the subtle changes in your spouse, like a weatherman reads storm clouds. And this wasn't the warm, genuine sound I'd fallen in love with back when we were both young and foolish enough to think love conquered everything. I'd been waiting in our den, half watching the evening news while my mind wandered to how empty the house felt these days. At 61, I suppose I'd grown comfortable with solitude, but comfortable isn't the same as content. Elena's consulting work had her traveling 3 weeks out of every month now, and each homecoming felt more distant than the last, like she was visiting a hotel rather than coming home to her husband. The sound of her heels clicking across our tile entryway pulled me from my thoughts. There was something different about her footsteps tonight. Lighter somehow, almost bouncing with an energy I hadn't heard in years. When I looked up from my newspaper, I caught a glimpse of her reflection in the hallway mirror, and she was smiling to herself in a way that made my stomach clench with unease. "Harold, I'm home," she called out, but the forced brightness in her voice immediately put me on edge. It was like listening to an actor deliver lines they'd rehearsed but didn't quite believe. I folded my newspaper and walked out to greet her, noting how she avoided eye contact as I leaned in for our usual welcome-home embrace. Her hug felt perfunctory, like she was going through the motions while her mind was elsewhere entirely. "How was Chicago?" I asked, searching her face for the usual exhaustion or frustration that followed her business trips. "Oh, you know how these client meetings go," she replied, waving dismissively while fumbling with her coat buttons. Her fingers seemed unusually clumsy, and I noticed a slight tremor in her hands. Same old presentations, same old handshakes. Nothing worth boring you with. This response stopped me cold. Elena had always been passionate about her work, ready to dissect every detail of difficult clients, breakthrough moments, and office politics. She'd regale me with stories about incompetent hotel staff, delayed flights, and the quirky habits of her colleagues. This vague deflection felt completely alien coming from her. "Really? Nothing interesting happened?" I pressed gently. "You seem, I don't know, energetic for someone who's had such a mundane trip." Her laugh came out too quickly, too sharp. Can't a woman be glad to be home with her husband? But even as she said it, she was already moving away from me, heading toward the staircase with her travel bag. When I instinctively moved to help her carry it upstairs, something I'd done automatically for over 2 decades, her reaction was swift and defensive. "Don't worry about that. I'll handle it later," she snapped, then caught herself and softened her tone. "I mean, I've got some work materials mixed in there. Confidential stuff, you understand? Client files and all that." The knot in my stomach tightened. In all our years together, Elena had never been secretive about her belongings. She'd always been fiercely independent, sure, but never guarded like this. She'd left client files scattered across our kitchen table countless times, discussed strategy meetings over dinner, even asked for my input on presentation ideas. This sudden concern about confidentiality felt manufactured. I watched her climb the stairs, noting how she clutched the bag close to her body, and wondered when my wife had become a stranger. That evening, over dinner at our usual spots across from each other at the kitchen table, I tried to draw her out about the trip. I asked about the hotel. Was it one of her regular places? How was the conference room set up? Did she manage to squeeze in any sightseeing? Elena picked at her salmon, giving me distracted one-word answers while scrolling through her phone. Every few seconds, her face would light up at something on the screen, and she'd start to smile before catching herself and forcing her expression back to neutral. "Who are you texting?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Just work stuff," she replied without looking up. "You know how it is? Clients don't respect boundaries." But I could see her thumbs moving rapidly across the screen, and her responses had the quick, frequent rhythm of a personal conversation, not professional correspondence. When her phone buzzed with what must have been a reply, she actually giggled, a sound I hadn't heard from her in months. "Everything all right at work?" I ventured. "You seem different tonight, more animated than usual." She looked up sharply, almost defensively, her green eyes flashing with something that looked like panic. "Why wouldn't it be all right? Can't a person just be tired after traveling?" The edge in her voice caught me off guard. I'd seen Elena handle hostile clients, demanding deadlines, and office politics with grace and composure. But a simple question from her husband had put her immediately on the defensive. "I didn't mean anything by it," I said carefully. "You just seem to have a lot of energy for someone who's exhausted." She set down her fork and gave me a look I couldn't quite decipher. Part guilt, part irritation, part something else entirely. "Harold, I love you, but sometimes you overthink everything. I'm fine. Work is fine. Can we just enjoy dinner?" But she didn't look fine. She looked like someone carrying a secret too big for her body to contain, and every few minutes it threatened to spill out, despite her best efforts to keep it locked away. Later, as we got ready for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of our marriage. Elena hummed while brushing her teeth, an old song I recognized but couldn't name, and there was a contentment in the sound that seemed to have nothing to do with being home with me. She'd always been beautiful, my Elena. Even now, at 58, she could turn heads when we walked into a restaurant together. Her auburn hair, recently styled at an expensive salon, framed a face that had aged gracefully, with laugh lines that spoke of joy rather than worry. But tonight, as I watched her go through her nighttime routine, I realized I was looking at a woman who seemed more alive than she'd been in years. When she slipped into bed beside me, she turned away immediately, claiming exhaustion, but I could sense she was wide awake. Her breathing had the controlled rhythm of someone pretending to sleep, and every few minutes she'd shift position restlessly. I lay there in the darkness, my mind spinning through the events of the evening. The laugh that didn't ring true, the secretiveness about her luggage, the defensive attitude about simple questions, the way she'd smiled at her phone, it all added up to something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Maybe I was overthinking things, like she'd said. Maybe the stress of her increased travel schedule was affecting both of us. Maybe I was just a 61-year-old man feeling insecure about his younger, successful wife. But deep in my gut, in that place where instinct lives, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, Elena left early for the office without our usual coffee together. For 20 years, we'd shared breakfast at our kitchen island, reading different sections of the newspaper and catching up on each other's plans for the day. It was one of those small rituals that had anchored our marriage through busy periods and stressful times. "I'm running behind," she called over her shoulder as she grabbed her purse and car keys. "Big presentation today. Don't wait up if I'm late tonight." But it was Thursday, and Elena rarely had presentations on Thursdays. Her schedule was usually lighter toward the end of the week, reserved for follow-up calls and planning for the next week's travel. Another detail that didn't quite fit. Once her car disappeared down our tree-lined street, I found myself standing in our bedroom, staring at her travel bag. It sat on the chair by our window, zipped shut and seemingly innocent, but it felt like it was mocking me. My conscience battled with my suspicion for several long minutes. In 22 years of marriage, I had never violated Elena's privacy. I'd never read her diary, searched through her belongings, or checked her phone. Trust had always been the foundation of our relationship, but trust, I was beginning to realize, required two people to maintain it. My hands trembled as I unzipped the main compartment. The smell that greeted me was unfamiliar, a cologne I didn't recognize mixed with Elena's usual perfume. At first, Everything appeared normal. Toiletries arranged in their familiar travel containers, a wrinkled silk blouse that needed pressing, her reading glasses case, and the small jewelry pouch she always carried. But tucked into a side pocket, folded small and shoved deep as if someone had tried to hide it, I discovered a crumpled restaurant receipt that made my heart skip several beats. The paper was from Morton's, an upscale steakhouse in downtown Chicago that Elena and I had visited once during a vacation years ago. It was the kind of place where dinner for two could easily cost $300. The receipt was dated 2 nights prior, and it clearly showed charges for 2 filet mignon dinners, 2 glasses of an expensive Cabernet, and a shared dessert. The timestamp showed 9:30 p.m., well past any reasonable business dinner hour. But here's what made my hands shake as I held that piece of paper. Elena had specifically called me that night, around 10 p.m. Chicago time, to tell me she was eating room service alone in her hotel room because she was too drained from meetings to go anywhere. "I'm just going to order a sandwich and watch some mindless TV," she'd said. I could still remember her exact words because I'd felt sorry for her, eating alone in a strange city while I sat in our comfortable kitchen finishing leftover meatloaf. So who had shared that expensive meal with her? And why had she felt the need to lie about something as simple as dinner plans? I tried to rationalize it as I carefully refolded the receipt and returned it to its hiding place. Maybe she'd entertained a client. Maybe the dinner had run later than expected, and she'd simplified the story when she called me. Maybe she'd felt guilty about the expense and didn't want to admit she'd splurged on an expensive meal. But even as I constructed these explanations, they felt hollow. Elena had never been secretive about business expenses. She'd often complained about clients who insisted on dining at overpriced restaurants, and she'd never felt the need to lie about work dinners before. I spent the rest of that day in a fog, unable to concentrate on anything. I tried to read, attempted to work in our garden, even started organizing my workshop in the garage, anything to keep my hands busy while my mind raced. But every task felt pointless when weighed against the growing certainty that my wife was lying to me about something significant. When Elena returned from work that evening, she seemed almost euphoric. She practically danced through the front door, humming that same tune from the night before. She'd stopped at the grocery store and bought ingredients for beef stroganoff, a dish she hadn't made in months because she claimed it was too much work for just the two of us. "You're in a remarkably good mood," I observed, watching her unpack groceries with unusual enthusiasm. "Can't a woman be happy?" she replied, but there was something almost guilty in her smile, like a child who'd been caught with her hand in the cookie jar but was trying to play innocent. "Of course you can. It's just that yesterday you seemed tired from your trip, and today you're practically glowing. Did something good happen at work?" She paused in her unpacking, her back turned to me, and I saw her shoulders tense slightly. When she turned around, her smile was too bright, too practiced. "Actually, yes. I think I might be up for a promotion soon. My supervisor hinted that some big changes are coming, and I might be in line for a senior position." This was the first I'd heard of any promotion possibilities, despite Elena typically sharing every detail of her career progress. She'd analyzed potential advancement opportunities obsessively, strategizing about which projects to pursue and which colleagues to cultivate. The fact that she'd mentioned none of this felt like another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. "That's wonderful," I said, studying her face. "What kind of position?" "Oh, it's still very preliminary," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I don't want to jinx it by talking about it too much, but it would involve more travel, probably some international work." "More travel. Of course it would." That night, as we shared the beef stroganoff she'd prepared with such enthusiasm, I found myself watching her more carefully than I had in years. She seemed younger somehow, more vibrant, like someone had turned up the brightness on her personality. Her eyes sparkled when she laughed, And she laughed often, sometimes at things that weren't particularly funny. But I also noticed how she kept glancing at her phone, which was face down on the table beside her plate. Every time it buzzed, which happened frequently throughout dinner, her eyes would dart toward it, and I'd catch a flash of something that looked like anticipation. "Popular evening for work calls," I commented, after the fifth or sixth buzz. "Oh, you know how it is," she said, but she was already reaching for the phone. Crisis management never sleeps in consulting. She glanced at the screen, and I saw her face light up with genuine pleasure before she caught herself and forced it back to neutral. But not before I'd noticed that whatever message she'd received had made her genuinely happy, in a way that had nothing to do with crisis management. "Actually," she said, standing up from the table, "I should probably take this. Client emergency. You don't mind if I step into my office for a few minutes?" Her home office was just down the hall, but she closed the door behind her, something she rarely did for business calls. Through the thin walls, I could hear the low murmur of her voice, punctuated by occasional laughter that sounded nothing like the professional tone she used with difficult clients. The call lasted 45 minutes. When she returned, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes bright. "Sorry about that," she said, but she didn't look sorry at all. She looked like someone who'd just had the best conversation of her week. "Everything resolved?" I asked. "Oh, you know how these things go. Sometimes you have to hold people's hands through the simplest problems." But her smile suggested she'd enjoyed every minute of that hand-holding. That night, I made a decision that went against everything I believed about trust and privacy in marriage. After Elena fell asleep, or after she'd settled into that controlled breathing pattern that suggested she was pretending to sleep, I carefully picked up her phone from the nightstand. Her passcode was still our wedding anniversary, which felt like a small mercy in a situation that was anything but merciful. My hands shook as I navigated to her text messages, unsure of what I was looking for, but certain I'd recognize it when I found it. Most of the conversations were exactly what you'd expect from a successful consultant. Exchanges with colleagues about project timelines, messages from our daughter checking in from college, appointment confirmations with her hairdresser and dentist. The normalcy of it all almost made me feel foolish for snooping. But then I found a conversation thread that made my world tilt on its axis. The contact was simply listed as C, just a single letter, which should have been my first warning sign. Elena was meticulous about her contacts, usually including full names and job titles for professional connections. The fact that this person rated only an initial suggested a level of intimacy that made my stomach clench. The messages weren't explicit, but they were intimate in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. C. Last night was incredible. I can't stop replaying every moment in my head. Elena. I know. I haven't felt this alive in years. You make me remember who I used to be. C. When can we do this again? I'm already counting the days until your next trip. Elena. Soon. I'll figure something out with Harold. My name in that context hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't Elena's husband in this conversation. I was an obstacle to be navigated, a problem to be solved. I scrolled up, looking for earlier messages, but it appeared she'd been deleting their conversation history regularly. Still, what I'd seen was enough to paint a picture that made me feel physically sick. The next message was time-stamped just an hour ago. During her client emergency call, C. I miss you already. 2 weeks feels like forever. Elena, I miss you too. More than I should. C. You don't have to feel guilty about being happy. Elena, I know. It's just complicated. C. It doesn't have to be. I set the phone back exactly where I'd found it, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Elena slept peacefully beside me, occasionally murmuring in her sleep, and I wondered if she was dreaming about him. The rest of the night passed in a haze of conflicting emotions. Rage at her betrayal, heartbreak at the loss of everything I'd thought our marriage was, And, perhaps strangest of all, a kind of relief at finally understanding why I'd been feeling like a stranger in my own home. As dawn broke through our bedroom curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't confront Elena based solely on text messages and suspicious behavior. She was too smart, too articulate. She'd find a way to explain everything away, to make me feel paranoid and foolish for doubting her. I needed concrete proof, something undeniable. That's when I made the hardest decision of my marriage. I hired a private investigator. The recommendation came from my lawyer, a man I'd consulted about estate planning the previous year. Catherine Morris, he told me when I called him that morning. Discreet, professional, and very good at what she does. If there's something to find, she'll find it. Catherine's office was in a nondescript building downtown, the kind of place you'd walk past without noticing. She was a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, but with kind eyes that suggested she'd seen enough human frailty to approach it with compassion rather than judgment. "I've been doing this for 15 years, she told me, as I sat across from her desk, feeling like a character in someone else's story. In my experience, spouses usually know something's wrong long before they're willing to admit it. The fact that you're here suggests you've been ignoring red flags for a while." I found myself telling her everything. The changes in Elena's behavior, the receipt from Chicago, the mysterious phone calls, the text messages I'd discovered. Catherine listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making notes on a legal pad. "How long do you want me to follow her?" she asked when I finished. "Until we know the truth," I replied. "Whatever that might be." "And if the truth is what you suspect it is, are you prepared for that?" I thought about Elena humming in our kitchen, about the way she'd smiled at her phone, about 22 years of marriage that might have been built on a foundation more fragile than I'd realized. "I don't think I have a choice," I said finally. Catherine nodded. "I'll need some basic information. Elena's travel schedule, recent photos, details about her work routine, and I'll need you to be prepared for this to take some time. People who are having affairs can be very careful about covering their tracks." But as it turned out, Elena wasn't as careful as she thought she was. The call came exactly 1 week later, on a Friday afternoon while I was trying to distract myself by cleaning out our garage. Catherine's voice was gentle but direct when she said, "Harold, I need you to come to my office. I have something you need to see." The drive across town felt endless. Every traffic light seemed to last forever. Every pedestrian moved with infuriating slowness. By the time I sat across from Catherine's desk again, my palms were damp with perspiration, and my heart was beating so hard I was sure she could hear it. She slid a manila envelope toward me with an expression of professional sympathy. "These were taken yesterday and this morning in Chicago," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, Harold." The first photograph showed Elena walking hand in hand with a man I didn't recognize through what was clearly a hotel lobby. The image was sharp and well lit. There was no mistaking her face or the intimacy of their body language. They were both smiling, leaning into each other with the easy familiarity of an established couple. My hands trembled as I moved to the second photo. This one showed them at a restaurant table, the same Morton's Steakhouse from the receipt I'd found. Elena was laughing at something he'd said, her hand covering his across the table, her wedding ring clearly visible but apparently meaningless. The third photograph captured them walking toward a hotel elevator, Elena's arms around his neck, his hands on her waist. They were kissing, and there was nothing tentative or guilt-ridden about it. This was the kiss of two people completely comfortable with their intimacy. But it was the final photograph that shattered something inside me that I don't think ever fully healed. Elena and this man entering what was clearly a hotel room together. The timestamp showed it was taken at 11:47 p.m., long after any business dinner should have ended. "His name is Christopher Valdez," Catherine said gently. He's a senior partner at Meridian Consulting, the firm Elena's been contracting with for the past 2 years. Based on hotel records and credit card receipts I was able to access, this relationship has been going on for at least 8 months. 8 months. I sat there absorbing that number, thinking about all the business trips, all the late nights at the office, all the times I'd worried about Elena being overworked or stressed about difficult clients. She hadn't been overworked at all. The pattern is consistent, Catherine continued. Every time Elena travels to Chicago, she books a single room for herself through her company's travel department. But Christopher Valdez books a room at the same hotel, same dates, usually on the same floor. They're careful not to travel together or register together, but they're definitely together. She showed me copies of hotel receipts, credit card statements, even flight records. The documentation was thorough and damning. Elena hadn't just had a brief affair. She'd been living a double life with military precision. There's more, Catherine said softly. The promotion she mentioned? Christopher Valdez has significant influence over contracting decisions at Meridian. Elena's recent contract renewals and rate increases correlate directly with the timeline of their relationship. This revelation hit me like a second wave of betrayal. It wasn't just that Elena was cheating on me. She was using that relationship to advance her career, mixing personal betrayal with professional ambition in a way that made everything feel even more calculated and cold. "Do you want me to continue investigating?" Catherine asked. "Sometimes there are other relationships, other patterns." I shook my head, unable to speak. I'd seen enough. More than enough. The drive home was a blur of conflicting emotions: rage, heartbreak, humiliation, and strangest of all, relief. At least now I knew why I'd been feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. At least now I understood why Elena had seemed more alive in recent months. At least now the pieces fit together, even if the picture they formed was one I'd never wanted to see. Elena's car was already in the driveway when I arrived. I sat in my own car for several long minutes, staring at our house, the colonial we'd bought when our daughter was small, where we'd hosted countless dinner parties and holiday gatherings, where I'd imagined we'd grow old together. How was I supposed to walk through that front door and pretend everything was normal? She was in the kitchen when I entered, chopping vegetables for what looked like a stir-fry, and humming that same tune I'd been hearing all week. The sound that had once seemed mysterious now felt like mockery. She was humming a love song, but it wasn't about love for me. "You're home late," she said without looking up, her knife moving rhythmically through a red bell pepper. "How was your day?" "Enlightening," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Something in my tone made her glance up. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of concern cross her face, but she quickly covered it with one of her practiced smiles. "Everything okay? You sound a bit off." I set my keys on the counter and looked at her. Really looked at her. Even now, caught in the middle of betraying our marriage, she was beautiful. Her auburn hair caught the light from our kitchen pendant lamps, and she moved with the grace of someone comfortable in her own skin. But as I studied her features, I realized I was looking at a stranger who happened to share a house with me. "Elena," I said carefully, "we need to talk." The knife paused in her hand, and I saw her shoulders tense slightly. She didn't look up from her cutting board. "About what?" "About Christopher." The knife slipped, and she jerked her hand back with a sharp intake of breath. A thin line of blood appeared on her finger, and she stuck it in her mouth automatically. But it wasn't the small cut that had drained the color from her face. It was the name I'd spoken. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and showed her one of Catherine's photographs, the one of her and Christopher walking hand in hand through the hotel lobby. Elena stared at the image, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish pulled from water. "Sit down," I said, not unkindly. We need to have an honest conversation for once." She moved to the kitchen table like she was sleepwalking, her legs unsteady. The confident, vibrant woman who'd been humming moments before had been replaced by someone who looked fragile and frightened. For several long minutes, neither of us spoke. Elena stared at her hands, including the finger she'd cut, which had stopped bleeding but left a small red mark that looked like evidence of her guilt. I tried to organize the tornado of thoughts in my head, to find words for a conversation I'd never imagined having. Finally, she looked up, and I saw tears gathering in her green eyes. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," I replied. "The question is, how long has it been going on?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. "Since last winter. February, actually. It wasn't supposed to happen, Harold. It just did." 8 months, I said, more to myself than to her. 8 months of lies. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "I tried to end it several times, but—" "But what?" She looked away, staring out our kitchen window at the garden we'd planted together 15 years ago. "He makes me feel things I'd forgotten I could feel. Excitement, passion, like I'm somebody worth pursuing instead of just somebody's wife managing somebody else's household." Her words cut deeper than I'd expected. "Is that how you see our marriage? Me just seeing you as somebody to manage my household?" "No, that's not." She struggled for words, her hands twisting in her lap. "Harold, we've been going through the motions for years. When was the last time we really talked about anything besides schedules and bills? When was the last time you looked at me the way he does?" I felt anger rising in my chest like bile. "So this is my fault? I drove you into another man's arms because I'm boring?" "That's not what I'm saying," she protested, but there was defensiveness in her voice that suggested it was exactly what she was saying. "I'm saying we both let this marriage drift into something comfortable, but not exciting. We became roommates who happened to share a bed. Comfortable isn't a crime, Elena. It's what happens when two people build a life together over decades. But apparently, that wasn't enough for you." She was crying now, mascara streaking down her cheeks in dark lines. "What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? Because I am. I'm sorry I hurt you, but I'm not sorry it happened." That admission hit me like a physical slap. She wasn't sorry for the betrayal itself, only sorry she'd been caught, sorry that her secret life had been exposed. I stood up from the table, suddenly needing distance between us. "I think you should pack a bag and stay somewhere else tonight. We'll figure out what comes next when we've both had time to think." "Harold, please." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. The touch that had once comforted me now felt contaminated. "We can work through this. We can go to counseling, figure out how to fix what's broken." "Fix what's broken?" I stared at her in disbelief. "Elena, you've been living a double life for 8 months. You've lied to me every single day, spent our money on hotel rooms with another man, and now you're telling me you're not even sorry it happened. What exactly is fixable about that?" She had no answer for that question. Elena packed a bag that night, moving through our bedroom like a ghost. She took practical things, toiletries, a few changes of clothes, her laptop for work. But she also took the small jewelry box where she kept her grandmother's earrings, and the framed photo of our daughter that usually sat on her nightstand. Those choices told me she wasn't planning on this being a temporary separation. "I'll stay at Rebecca's," she said, referring to her sister who lived across town. "Just until we figure things out." "There's nothing to figure out," I replied quietly. "You made your choice 8 months ago. You just didn't have the courage to tell me about it." She paused at our bedroom door, her suitcase in hand. "Harold, I know you don't believe this right now, but I do love you. What I have with Christopher It's different. It's not about love. Then what is it about? She was quiet for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she said, "It's about feeling alive again." After she left, the house felt different. Not just quiet. It had been quiet plenty of times when Elena was traveling. This was a profound silence, the kind that settles into the walls when something fundamental has shifted. I poured myself a glass of the good scotch we kept for special occasions and sat in my den, surrounded by the detritus of our shared life. 22 years of marriage reduced to a manila envelope full of photographs and hotel receipts. 22 years of shared breakfasts, joint tax returns, coordinated social calendars, and synchronized sleep schedules. 22 years of assuming I knew the woman sleeping beside me, only to discover she'd become a stranger who hummed love songs about another man. Over the next few weeks, Elena and I had several more conversations, mostly through lawyers, but occasionally face-to-face when practical matters required it. She wanted to try counseling, wanted to work on us, but her heart clearly wasn't in it. During one of our few direct meetings, I asked her the question that had been haunting me. "Are you still seeing him?" She looked down at her hands, and I had my answer before she spoke. "I can't just turn my feelings off, Harold. It's not that simple." "It is that simple," I replied. "You choose to honor your marriage, or you don't. You chose not to. You make it sound so black and white. It is black and white. That's what marriage vows are, a promise to forsake all others. You broke that promise." She looked up then, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been pity. "Harold, I haven't been happy in this marriage for a long time. Neither have you, if you're honest about it. We've been living parallel lives, not shared ones." Maybe she was right about that. Maybe we had grown apart in ways I'd been too comfortable or too afraid to acknowledge. But that didn't excuse what she'd done, and it didn't change the fundamental fact that she'd chosen to lie rather than have a difficult conversation about the state of our marriage. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly amicable, probably because Elena was eager to move on to her new life. We split our assets fairly, sold the house that no longer felt like home to either of us, and worked out arrangements for staying in touch with our daughter, who was devastated but ultimately understanding. "I kind of saw this coming," Jessica told me during one of our long phone conversations. "Mom's been different when I talked to her lately. Happier, but in a way that didn't seem to include you, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense, actually. On the day our divorce was finalized, I felt an unexpected sense of freedom. Yes, it was the end of a significant chapter of my life, but it was also the beginning of something new. For the first time in years, I didn't have to wonder what Elena was really thinking or where she actually was when she said she was working late. I didn't have to decode the meaning behind her silences or try to understand why she seemed more excited about leaving for business trips than coming home from them. I bought a smaller house closer to downtown, enrolled in a photography class I'd been talking about taking for years, and started volunteering at the local animal shelter. Simple things, but they felt like acts of rebellion against the man I'd become, someone who'd organized his entire life around accommodating someone else's schedule and needs. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I ran into Elena and Christopher at our local grocery store. They were in the produce section, debating the merits of different varieties of apples with the kind of playful intimacy that couples develop when they're comfortable with each other. Christopher was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was used to being the smartest person in any room he entered. He looked like the kind of man who belonged on magazine covers promoting luxury watches or expensive cars. They seemed happy together, and surprisingly, I felt no bitterness seeing them. Elena was glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years, animated and vibrant as she laughed at something Christopher whispered in her ear. This was the woman she'd become, or perhaps the woman she'd always been. buried under years of routine and compromise. Elena noticed me first, her laughter fading as our eyes met across the produce display. She said something to Christopher, who glanced in my direction with polite curiosity, then approached me cautiously. "Harold," she said softly, "how are you?" "I'm well," I replied, and meant it. "You look happy." She smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I am. I hope. I hope you can find happiness too." "I'm working on it," I told her honestly. Christopher joined us then, extending his hand with professional courtesy. "You must be Harold. I've heard so much about you." I wondered what Elena had told him about me, about our marriage, about the man she'd chosen to leave. But it didn't matter anymore. "Nice to meet you," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, confident, the handshake of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. We exchanged a few more pleasantries before they moved on to continue their shopping. As I watched them walk away together, Elena's hand resting comfortably on Christopher's arm, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had consumed me during those first weeks after discovering her betrayal had burned itself out, leaving something that felt almost like gratitude. Not gratitude for the betrayal itself, but for the clarity it had brought. Elena's affair had forced me to confront truths about our marriage that I'd been avoiding for years. We had become roommates, just as she'd said. We had been going through the motions, maintaining the structure of a marriage without nurturing its soul. The difference was that she'd chosen to seek excitement elsewhere, while I'd chosen to accept the status quo. Neither choice was necessarily right or wrong. They were just different responses to the same underlying problem. That evening, I called my daughter to tell her about the encounter. Jessica was in her final year at Northwestern, studying journalism with the same fierce determination Elena had always brought to her career goals. "How do you feel about seeing them together?" she asked, her voice careful in the way children's voices become when they're trying to navigate their parents' complicated emotions. Honestly, it was easier than I expected. They looked like they belonged together. "And you? Do you think you'll ever want that again? Someone to belong with?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for months. At 62, was I too old to start over? Too set in my ways to learn how to be part of a couple again? Too damaged by betrayal to trust someone new? "I don't know," I told her honestly, "but I'm learning that I like my own company more than I thought I would." And that was true. The solitude that had initially felt like punishment had gradually become a gift. I could eat dinner at 5 o'clock if I wanted to, or at 9 o'clock if I got caught up in a photography project. I could spend entire Saturdays reading without someone sighing pointedly about household chores that needed attention. I could make decisions about vacation destinations, restaurant choices, even what to watch on television, without having to negotiate or compromise. For the first time in decades, I was learning who Harold was when he wasn't half of a couple. But that didn't mean I was content with permanent solitude. A few months after the grocery store encounter, I met someone at the photography club I'd joined. Her name was Margaret, and she was a retired teacher who'd taken up nature photography after her husband passed away 3 years earlier. She was younger than Elena, with silver hair she wore in a practical bob, and laugh lines that spoke of a life lived with genuine joy rather than manufactured contentment. We started as friends, bonding over our shared frustration with camera settings and our mutual appreciation for early morning light. Margaret had a way of seeing beauty in ordinary things, the way frost formed on fallen leaves, the patterns that shadows made on brick walls, the expression on a dog's face when it spotted a squirrel. Our friendship developed slowly, without the intensity or urgency that had characterized my relationship with Elena. We'd meet for coffee after photography walks, sharing stories about our grown children and comparing notes about the strange experience of rebuilding your life in your 60s. Margaret had been married for 37 years before becoming a widow. and she understood the disorientation of suddenly being responsible for all your own decisions. The hardest part, she told me one afternoon, as we sat on a park bench reviewing the photos we'd taken that morning, was remembering that I could change the thermostat without asking someone else's opinion first. I laughed, recognizing the truth in her observation. For me, it was realizing I could buy groceries based on what I actually wanted to eat, instead of what someone else might want for dinner 3 days from now. Such small freedoms, she said, smiling. But they add up to something larger, don't they? They did. Each small choice I made independently felt like a tiny act of self-discovery. I was learning that I preferred jazz to classical music when I was alone, that I actually enjoyed cooking when I could experiment without worrying about someone else's preferences, and that I was more social than I'd realized when I wasn't constantly managing the dynamic between my own needs and Elena's expectations. Margaret and I had been friends for nearly a year before our relationship shifted into something deeper. It happened gradually, without dramatic declarations or passionate moments. One evening, after a particularly successful photography expedition to capture the autumn colors along the river, we found ourselves lingering over dinner at a small restaurant neither of us had tried before. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said, setting down her wine glass and looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Of course. Do you ever think about Elena? Wonder if you made the right choice in divorcing her?" It wasn't a question I'd expected, but I appreciated her directness. Margaret had never been one to dance around difficult topics. "I think about her sometimes," I said honestly, "but not in the way you might expect. I don't miss her exactly. I miss the idea of her, the woman I thought I was married to. But that woman may never have existed outside my imagination." "What do you mean?" I considered how to explain something I was still trying to understand myself. "I think I spent so many years projecting my own needs and expectations onto Elena that I stopped seeing who she actually was. And maybe she did the same thing with me. We were both performing versions of ourselves that we thought the other person wanted." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "That's a kind of loneliness, isn't it? Being married to someone who doesn't really see you." "Yes," I said, surprised by how accurately she'd identified the feeling I'd struggled to name. "It is exactly that kind of loneliness." "And now?" "Now I feel seen," I said, looking at her across the table. Maybe for the first time in years. That conversation marked the beginning of what I can only call the most honest relationship of my life. Margaret and I both came to it with the clarity that only comes from having loved and lost, from having made mistakes and learned from them. We had no illusions about perfection or forever. We were simply two people who enjoyed each other's company and chose to build something together based on mutual respect rather than desperate need. We've been together for 3 years now. We maintain separate homes because we both value our independence, but we share most of our evenings and weekends. We travel together, pursue our photography hobby together, and make decisions together without the undercurrent of resentment or accommodation that had poisoned my marriage with Elena. Last month, I received an unexpected piece of news that brought Elena back into my thoughts. Jessica called to tell me that Elena and Christopher had broken up. Apparently, the promotion Elena had been so excited about had required Christopher to relocate to their company's London office, and Elena had discovered that the relationship she'd blown up her marriage for wasn't strong enough to survive the inconvenience of an international move. "She asked me to ask you if you'd be willing to have coffee with her," Jessica told me. "She says she has things she wants to say to you." I thought about it for several days. What could Elena possibly want to say to me now, 3 years after our divorce was finalized? What conversation could we have that would benefit either of us? In the end, curiosity won out. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory that held no memories for either of us. Elena looked older when she walked in, not just in the physical sense, but in a way that suggested the weight of consequences. Her auburn hair was shorter now, and she'd stopped coloring the gray that was beginning to show at her temples. She was still beautiful, but there was something fragile about her that hadn't been there before. "Thank you for coming," she said, as she sat down across from me, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. "Jessica said you wanted to talk." Elena nodded, then seemed to struggle with where to begin. Finally, she looked up and met my eyes directly. "I want to apologize," she said. "Not just for the affair, but for everything. For the way I handled it. For the things I said to you. For making you feel like our marriage's problems were your fault." I waited, sensing there was more. "Christopher and it's over. Has been for 6 months now. And I've had a lot of time to think about what I threw away and why I threw it away." "What did you conclude?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That I was a coward. Instead of having a difficult conversation with you about what was missing in our marriage, I chose to look for it somewhere else. I told myself I was being brave, following my heart, but I was actually taking the easiest possible path." "Elena, let me finish, please." Her voice was quiet, but firm. "You deserved better than what I gave you. You deserved honesty, even if it was painful. You deserved a wife who was willing to fight for what we had instead of running away from it." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving justification, but I saw only genuine regret. "What happened with Christopher?" I asked. Elena's smile was rueful. "Reality happened. It turns out that relationships built on excitement and secrecy don't necessarily translate well to everyday life. When we tried to build something real together, we discovered we didn't actually have much in common beyond physical attraction and the thrill of sneaking around. I'm sorry it didn't work out." "Are you?" I considered the question honestly. "I'm sorry you're hurting. But I'm not sorry our marriage ended. As painful as it was, it forced both of us to confront truths we'd been avoiding." Elena nodded. "Jessica tells me you're happy now, with someone named Margaret." "I am." "I'm glad," she said, and I could tell she meant it. "I want you to be happy, Harold. You're a good man who deserved better than what I gave you." We talked for another hour, covering ground that had been too painful to navigate during our divorce proceedings. Elena told me about the loneliness she'd felt in our marriage, about feeling invisible and taken for granted. I told her about my own feelings of inadequacy, about sensing her dissatisfaction but not knowing how to address it. It was the conversation we should have had years ago, before the distance between us had become so vast that she'd felt the need to build a bridge to someone else instead of trying to repair the one we shared. As we prepared to leave, Elena reached across the table and briefly touched my hand. "I know this doesn't change anything," she said, "but I want you to know that I loved you. I loved the life we built together, even if I lost sight of that along the way." "I know," I said. "I loved you too." And I had. Not the woman who'd betrayed our marriage, but the woman I'd thought I was married to. The woman who'd existed in the spaces between her deceptions, in the moments when she'd let her guard down and shown me glimpses of her authentic self. Walking back to my car after our coffee, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Elena's apology wouldn't change the past, but it provided context for it. Understanding doesn't erase betrayal, but it can help you make peace with it. That evening, I told Margaret about my meeting with Elena. We were sitting on her back porch, watching the sunset paint her garden in shades of gold and amber, our cameras nearby in case the light became too beautiful to resist. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked, her hand finding mine on the arm of the porch swing. "Peaceful," I said, realizing it was true. For the first time since this whole thing started, I feel like I understand what happened and why it happened. And what do you understand? I thought about Elena's words, about the regret in her eyes, about the 3 years of healing and growth that had brought me to this moment, with this woman who saw me clearly and loved me anyway. I understand that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can also be the best thing, I said. Elena's betrayal destroyed the marriage I thought I had, but it also freed me to build the life I actually wanted. Margaret squeezed my hand. And what kind of life is that? I looked at her, this woman who'd taught me that love could be both passionate and peaceful, exciting and stable, built on truth rather than illusion. An honest one, I said. As we sat there watching the sun set over Margaret's carefully tended garden, I realized that Elena had been right about one thing. I was happier now than I'd been in years. But it wasn't because I'd found someone to make me complete. It was because I'd finally learned to be complete on my own, which made choosing to share my life with Margaret a gift rather than a necessity. The betrayal that had shattered my world had ultimately rebuilt it stronger and truer than before. Elena's affair had forced me to confront the man I'd become and decide whether I liked him. The answer, it turned out, was complicated. I didn't like the passive, accommodating version of myself who'd allowed his marriage to drift into comfortable dissatisfaction. But I did like the man who'd emerged from the wreckage, someone capable of hard choices, honest conversations, and the kind of love that sees clearly and chooses consciously. At 65, I was finally learning what it meant to live authentically. And while the journey to get here had been more painful than anything I'd ever experienced, I wouldn't trade the destination for all the comfortable lies in the world. Sometimes the end of one story is actually the beginning of another, better one. Sometimes betrayal is just another word for liberation. And sometimes the person you become after surviving the worst thing that ever happened to you is exactly who you were meant to be all along.